My dear, my very dear Wormwood, my poppet, my pigsney, how mistakenly, now that all is lost, you come whimpering to ask me whether the terms of affection in which I address you meant nothing from the beginning. Far from it. Rest assured, my love for you and your love for me are as like two peas. I have always desired you, as you, pitiful fool, desired me. The difference is that I am stronger. I think they will give you to me now, or a bit of you. Love you? Why, yes, as dainty a morsel as I ever grew fat on. You have let a soul slip through your fingers. The howl of sharpened famine for that loss re-echoes at this moment through all the levels of the kingdom of noise, down to the very throne itself. It makes me mad to think of it. How well I know what happened at the instant when they snatched him from you. There was a sudden clearing of his eyes, was there not, as he saw you for the first time, and recognized the part you had in him, and knew that you had it no longer. Just think, and let it be the beginning of your agony, what he felt at that moment, as if a scab had fallen from an old sore, as if he were emerging from a hideous shell-like tetter, as if he shuffled off for good and all a defiled, wet, clinging garment. By hell, it is a misery enough to see them in their mortal days, taking off dirtied and uncomfortable clothes and splashing in hot water and giving little grunts of pleasure, stretching their eased limbs. What, then, of this final stripping, this complete cleansing? The more one thinks about it, the worse it becomes. He got through so easily. No gradual misgivings, no doctor's sentence, no nursing homes, no operating theaters, no hopes of life. Sheer instantaneous liberation. One moment it seemed to be all our world, the scream of bombs, the fall of houses, the stink and taste of high explosive on the lips and in the lungs, the feet burning with weariness, the heart cold with horrors, the brain reeling, the legs aching. Next moment, all this was gone. Gone like a bad dream, never again to be of any account. Defeated, outmaneuvered fool! Did you mark how naturally, as if he had been born for it, the earth-born vermin entered the new life? How all his doubts became, in the twinkling of an eye, ridiculous. I know what the creature was saying to itself. Yes, of course, it always was like this. All horrors have followed the same course, getting worse and worse, forcing you into a kind of bottleneck till, at the very moment when you thought you must be crushed, behold, you were out of the narrows and all was suddenly well. The extraction hurt more and more, and then the tooth was out. The dream became a nightmare, and then you woke. You die, and then you are beyond death. How could I have ever doubted it? As he saw you, he also saw them. I know how it was. You reeled back, dizzy and blinded, more hurt by him than he has ever been by bombs. The degradation of it. That this thing of earth and slime could stand upright and converse with spirits before whom you, a spirit, could only cower. Perhaps you had hoped that the awe and strangeness of it would dash his joy. But that is the cursed thing. The gods are strange to mortal eyes, and yet they are not strange. He had no faintest conception till that very hour of how they would look, and even doubted their existence. But when he saw them, he knew that he had always known them, and realized what part each one of them had played at many an hour in his life, when he had supposed himself alone. So that now he could say to them one by one, not, "Who are you?" but, "So it was you all the time." All that they were and said at this meeting woke memories. The dim consciousness of friends about him which had haunted his solitudes from infancy was now at last explained. That central music in every pure experience which had always just evaded memory was now at last recovered. Recognition made him free of their company almost before the limbs of his corpse became quiet. Only you were left outside. He saw not only them, he saw him. This animal, this thing begotten in a bed could look on him. What is blinding, suffocating fire to you is now cool light to him, is clarity itself, and wears the form of a man. You would like, if you could, to interpret the patient's prostration in the presence, his self-abhorrence and utter knowledge of his sins. Yes, Wormwood, a clearer knowledge even than yours. On the analogy of your own choking and paralyzing sensations when you encounter the deadly air that breathes from the heart of heaven. But it's all nonsense. Pains he may still have to encounter, but they embrace those pains. They would not barter them for any earthly pleasure. All the delights of sense or heart or intellect with which you could once have tempted him, even the delights of virtue itself, now seem to him in comparison but as the half-nauseous attractions of a raddled harlot would seem to a man who hears that his true beloved, whom he had loved his whole life, and whom he had believed to be dead, is alive, and even now at his door. He is caught up into that world where pain and pleasure take on transfinite values, and all our arithmetic is dismayed. Once more, the inexplicable meets us. Next to the curse of useless tempters like yourself, the greatest curse upon us is the failure of our intelligence department. If only we could find out what he is really up to. Alas, that knowledge in itself, so hateful and mawkish a thing, should yet be necessary for power. Sometimes I am almost in despair. All that sustains me is the conviction that our realism, our rejection in the face of all temptations, of all silly nonsense and claptrap, must win in the end. Meanwhile, I have you to settle with. Most truly do I sign myself, your increasingly and ravenously affectionate uncle, Screwtape.
This is the end. Just kidding. But the story does end with the patient dying, so that's great. Yay? In truth, this is a really amazing feat. The patient dies, and it's celebrated. Obviously, it's not celebrated by Screwtape and Wormwood. Now, this is a pretty interesting thing, because typically within a story, a person dying is actually considered to be kind of a sad thing. You're all right.
I don't know what's happening. I don't know. Hurry. I don't want to go. I don't want to go. Sir, please.
There you go. But in this case, we're actually meant to celebrate the fact that the patient died. Now, I'm not saying we're dancing on his grave or anything. You know, I just realized how truly disturbing that image actually is. But we're actually excited about the fact that the patient no longer has to go through the suffering and trials that Screwtape and Wormwood put him through. So, yeah, we're actually happy that he died.
Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like a room without a roof.
Remember what we said. Whatever Screwtape hates, we should be excited for. And whatever he loves, we should fear. So what does Screwtape hate in this section? Well, he hates the fact that the patient died and went to heaven. He describes it this way. The howl of sharpened famine for that loss re-echoes at this moment through all the levels of the kingdom of noise and down to the very throne itself. Do you realize what he's saying here? He's saying that whenever a soul is lost to hell and goes to heaven, that even Satan himself feels the echo. This is kind of a reversal of what Jesus says in Luke chapter 15, verse 7. I tell you, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance. So you see, if all of heaven rejoices when one soul repents, then all of hell would cry out in agony when one soul repents. This is one of the things that I love about this book, by the fact that it forces you to look at things kind of sideways. And by looking at them sideways, you get to have a new perspective on something that you thought you understood. But now, because you've looked at it sideways, you understand it better. There are so many things that I could pull out of this book that I haven't even begun to touch on in this series. That's why I keep coming back to it again and again. I know, I've said this stuff over and over again, but I really hope you guys see it too when you read this, that there's more here than what can be taken in one reading. Let's take a moment and look at the way the patient died. Now, the implication is that he died during the bombing of London during World War II. And earlier in the book, when Screwtape was freaking out about how the patient was able to meet a girl that he fell in love with who was a Christian, he describes him as a Bobby. Now, if you know your history or you know anything about England, police officers are called bobbies. Now, you can look up as to why that actually is. It's really interesting. But for the sake of this story, what was interesting about that is the fact that bobbies, or police officers, during World War II, it was their job to do two major things. One, it was to get people to safety in order to go to shelters so they wouldn't be harmed in the bombings. But it was also their job to patrol the streets while the bombings were still happening to make sure that people's property wasn't stolen by opportunistic thieves. So it was a very dangerous job. In fact, the fact that he died in this story isn't really that surprising, but being the main character, it is a little bit. So we can infer that the patient died doing his duty during the bombings. And it's interesting how Screwtape describes this. He actually describes it as a good thing. He calls it a sheer instantaneous moment where he doesn't have to sit around and suffer. He doesn't have long moments of doubts. He doesn't have any difficulties with trials or anything like that. It's just quick, instantaneous, moving from one existence to the next. And he implies that this is a good thing for the patient. Obviously, it's not a good thing for him, but for the patient, it is a good thing. It's kind of like what's described in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed. For this perishable body must put on the imperishable, and this mortal body must put on immortality. When the perishable puts on the imperishable, and the mortal puts on the immortality, then shall come to pass the saying that is written, Death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? So for a Christian, as the patient was in the end, death isn't an end in of itself. Rather, it's the beginning of the new life. Obviously, Screwtape hates this with a passion, and he blames Wormwood for all of it. There is no forgiveness in hell, so why would demons have forgiveness for each other? If you've read the book, you kind of get the impression that Wormwood is a bit incompetent and kind of stupid. And so, yeah, you could put everything at his feet, but if you look a little deeper, you also kind of start to feel a little bad for him. Because really, when you look at it, Screwtape doesn't actually want Wormwood to succeed in the sense of him doing well. He only wants him to succeed so that he may have something to feed on. If you remember from one of the earlier chapters, the philosophy of hell is that the stronger will feed on the weaker. And so now that the patient has been taken to heaven, Screwtape explains that Wormwood has proved himself weaker, and therefore he will be consumed by the stronger ones in hell. Now that I think about it, how does that even work? The answer is, it doesn't. This is a work of fiction. It's an allegory. This isn't supposed to be literal. This is supposed to help us understand ourselves and supposed to help us understand the truths of the Bible. For instance, in 1 Peter 5:8, it says this, Be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. So, is Peter saying that the devil is a lion wanting a meal? Well, not literally. The devil isn't a physical being, so he doesn't require food to eat. What he's saying is the fact that because the devil wants to destroy everything that God loves and has died for, he's like a lion who is intently pursuing a meal. Eventually, that lion is going to eat. He wants to eat something, and it doesn't matter what gets in his way. In the same way, the devil is pursuing all that which God loves, and he will not stop until he gets what he wants.
Your brother's soul is mine.
The chapter ends with Screwtape kind of describing to Wormwood what happened to the patient and how great it is and how amazing it is. But he also doesn't actually believe it. He seems to think that God is lying, that he actually has some kind of ulterior motive for saving people, because it couldn't possibly be this love thing that he keeps talking about, which is truly sad and ironic and funny all at the same time. How does that even work? In this section, we also get to see a little bit of a glimpse of one of C.S. Lewis's well-known abilities, and that was to be able to describe heaven. He was able to describe heaven in such a way that made you want to be there right now. Not later on, but right now. I don't know if that means that C.S. Lewis was that amazing of a writer, or just we have really bad descriptions of heaven in our minds. It's probably both. If you want to get a more detailed description of heaven from C.S. Lewis' perspective, I would recommend reading the book The Great Divorce. This book is all about a group of people from hell who take a bus ride to heaven. How does that even work? What follows is one of the most beautiful and intriguing descriptions of heaven that I've ever read. Here's a quote from that book. "Heaven is reality itself. All that is fully real is heavenly. For all that can be shaken will be shaken, and only the unshakable remains." Pretty cool, huh? So anyway, Screwtape Letters ends with the patient going to heaven and Screwtape planning to eat wormwood. How does that even work? And we as the readers are left with the question, okay, now what? What do we do with this? Well, I think there are 3 things we can take away from this. As I've said before, though, you can take way more than 3 things away from this book, but just go with me here. The first thing that we can learn is the fact that the Christian life will have its ups and downs. You're going to have times in your life where your faith is really strong, and you're going to have other times in your life where you think your faith is very weak. But there's no guarantee about it being easy. God actually specifically says that it won't be, that it will be difficult. But if we know going forward that it's going to be a struggle, that it will have ups and downs, we can be prepared for those ups and downs when they come. The second thing that we can take away from this is the fact that God is with us every step of the way. Well, God and the angels don't make an actual appearance in this story, at least directly. We can see their hands in this. We can see God working in the patient's life every step of the way. Screwtape mentions it a few times, but it's kind of just in passing. But if you look closely at this story, you can really see how God is constantly working in the patient's life, even though the only thing we're really seeing is from the demon's perspective. The last thing is that God will win in the end. If you read closely, you'll notice that despite all of Wormwood's blusters and brags about the power of hell and the power of temptation and how they will win in the end, he really doesn't believe it. He doesn't think that they'll win in the end. It's all just bragging. Newsflash, he won't win in the end. And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." So you see, doesn't matter what Satan says, doesn't matter what demons like Screwtape says. In the end, God will win. Guys, I want to thank you so much for joining me on this journey through this book. If you haven't read it yet, please pick it up and read it. If you have read it, I highly recommend you jump into The Great Divorce. If you enjoyed the Screwtape Letters especially, that will be a great book for you. And if neither of those sound good to you, well, shoot me a line. Tell me what you like. Maybe I can recommend something for you to look into. For now, though, have a great weekend, and I'll see you guys soon.